Hi, this is the Cold Vengeance community. We share the most captivating and intriguing stories that end in cold revenge. Subscribe and stay with us.
I grew up in a small house in suburban New Jersey. My parents always told us to be practical and not spend money on unnecessary things. When I was 10, they decided we needed real responsibility and bought me a puppy. He was a red Labrador, energetic and smart, and I immediately became attached to him. I named him Max. Every day after school, I ran home to walk him, fed him, taught him commands, and even tried to train him for competitions that were sometimes shown on TV. He became more than just an animal to me. He was my friend, my companion, and this gave me a sense of stability in a house where my parents constantly argued and fought over trivial things. I remember one time asking my mom if I could keep Max in the house if I went to college. She looked at me and laughed, saying we'd have a lot to discuss, but I didn't realize it was the first clue that our paths would soon be diverging. My parents often argued about money. My dad said a puppy was an expense, my mom tried to defend him, but more often than not she gave in. I remember them discussing having to give someone away because we need space and it's expensive. I tried to convince them that Max was part of the family, that they couldn't just give him away, but that day my words didn't matter. A few weeks later, they announced that the puppy had been sold to the neighbors. I didn't know how to react. I was 10 years old, but the sense of loss was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I remember sitting on my bed, looking at the empty cage where Max slept, and thinking that the world would never be the same again. I tried to understand why my parents had made this decision, but their explanations rang hollow. They said it was for his own good, that we have too many responsibilities, but I felt it was simply their inability to care for something that wasn't truly theirs. The years went by. I moved out of home, went to college, worked, built my life. I would occasionally see Max when my parents came over with other people or mentioned him casually, but I could never hold him in my arms again. As an adult, the resentment I felt toward my parents only grew. It became part of my history, my memory, something I wanted to correct in the future. My parents bought me a car when I was 15. It was an old sedan, something like a Ford Taurus, which they used to drive around town and to work. My mother drove most often, my father preferred the bus, but they talked about the car as if it were an important part of their lives, although to me it was simply a symbol of their familiar routine. After school, I'd often sit by the window and watch them drive down the street, arguing about directions, gas, insurance. I'd never been much of a car person, but that car always reminded me of the day they sold Max. It sat in the yard dirty with a few dents, and I thought it wasn't just transportation, but part of their ingrained attitude toward things, easy to give away, easy to sell, easy to throw away. In college, I started making my first money. I remember planning my first real buying experience, wanting to prove to myself and the world that I could own something and be in control. I dreamed of a home, of independence, of no one else being able to dictate my life without my consent. During that period, I began plotting revenge, though I didn't even call it revenge back then. It was more a feeling that I needed to reclaim control and bring justice for the loss of Max. After college, I returned home for a while to take care of some family matters and noticed my parents' old car sitting in the yard. It looked even worse than I remembered, the paint peeling, the tires slightly flat, and I felt a strange satisfaction, knowing it would be part of my future. My parents never said they were going to replace the car. They continued to drive it as if it belonged to their past, and I realized this was an opportunity I shouldn't miss. I started saving money, observed the used car market, learned how to properly value a car, how to negotiate a safe deal, and gradually formed a plan that seemed logical and fair to me. I understood that this wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of their relationship to me, to my feelings, and to what I'd lost in childhood. Understanding this forced me to act carefully and purposefully. I didn't want to act impulsively. I wanted everything to seem natural, so they couldn't suspect my intentions. The car became a project for me, a way to regain some control, and perhaps partially heal the old wounds Max had left behind. I began keeping an eye on car dealerships and classified ads, studying the histories of similar transactions, reading reviews of how people buy cars from relatives without causing conflict, and preparing for the moment when I could act. This process took years. I changed, they changed, and every time I saw the car, I thought of Max and felt a strange mixture of anger and regret. Sometimes I thought that if I could go back in time, I would do everything differently. I would scream, beg, and try to convince them, but time passed, and that was too late. Then one day I saw an ad online for an old car of a similar model for sale. I immediately knew it was my parents' car. I confirmed the VIN, and I was sure it was indeed theirs. I felt a surge of energy and determination. This wasn't just a purchase, it was an opportunity to complete an old story, to close a gestalt that had haunted me since childhood. I contacted the seller, filled out all the paperwork, paid for the car, and brought it home. The car sat in the parking lot and I looked at it, remembering my days with Max, days when the world seemed stable and safe, and my parents seemed like people I could rely on. Now everything was different. The car had become an object of control, a symbol of my ability to decide what to do with it, and this feeling gave me a strange satisfaction I'd never experienced as a child. I began planning my next step, thinking about how exactly to end this story so that it would give me a sense of closure, but at the same time, so that my parents couldn't interfere and ruin my plan. I understood that this process would require time and patience, and I was prepared to proceed carefully, following a predetermined plan. All these years I learned from my mistakes, observed them, their habits, how they treated things and people, and used this knowledge to implement my plan, which now seemed completely logical and fair to me. After I bought their car, I decided not to rush into action. The car sat in the yard of my garage. I watched it every day, checked the paperwork, and planned how to safely implement my plan. After a few weeks, my parents began to notice changes. My mother asked why I was suddenly interested in an old car, and my father pretended it wasn't important, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. They came for short visits, and every time I brought up the car, my mother tried to joke or change the subject. I tried not to show that I felt pressure, but I knew they suspected something. I began to analyze their behavior more. My father began asking where I had gotten the money for the purchase, asking if I'd borrowed it from anyone, trying to understand why this particular vehicle was so important to me. I answered evasively, saying I simply wanted to buy a used car, and we tried to end the conversation there. My mother began calling more often, asking if I needed help with the car, if it would be difficult to maintain, and in these questions I heard notes of anxiety, a suspicion that I might be plotting something. I knew I had to tread carefully. Any careless step could ruin my entire plan, and this only increased the tension. I began to observe their habits, when they arrived, what questions they reacted to strongly, what irritated them, and what didn't attract their attention. This gave me an understanding of how best to behave so they wouldn't guess my intentions. After a few days, I noticed my mother began hinting to my friends that I was becoming too infatuated with the old car, that it was no longer a normal obsession. I saw her trying to find out something from the neighbors about my activities, and this made me realize they suspected the car meant more to me than just transportation. I began adjusting my actions, meeting with mechanics and junkyards, pretending to be simply interested in cars, thus creating the appearance of normal activity. My parents visited more and more often, sometimes unexpectedly, and each time I felt they were trying to catch me at my word, to find out what I was planning. One day, when they stopped by the garage under the pretext of looking at the car, I kept my cool, showed the paperwork, explained that I'd checked the brakes, oil and tires, as if it were a routine purchase, and they found no reason to question it. I noticed that my father still looked at the car with distrust. My mother tried to smile, but there was tension in her eyes. That day showed me that my plan needed to be implemented carefully and gradually. I decided that I wouldn't rush, that it was important to create a situation in which my parents would think the car meant nothing special to me. Over the next few weeks, I pretended the car was just a part of my life, showed interest in other cars in the ad, discussed buying other things with them, and gradually their attention to the old car began to wane. But I knew this success was temporary, that my parents remained suspicious, and any sudden action on my part could ruin everything. One evening, my mother called and asked if I could take the car to a mechanic she knew to check for any serious problems. She sounded friendly, but I saw it as a test, an attempt to understand my plans. I agreed, explaining that I wanted to do it myself to save money, and for a while she tried to convince me to take someone with me, but I persisted. At that moment, I realized my parents were genuinely starting to worry about me tampering with the car. This feeling gave me a strange satisfaction, but at the same time, it made me more wary. I began planning times when they wouldn't see the car, how to move it safely, how to avoid questions, and still maintain the appearance of ordinary interest. Every day as I walked out to the car, I thought back to losing Max as a child, how their decision to sell the puppy had affected me, and I realized that I could now end this old story if I acted correctly. My parents gradually retreated, their suspicions lingering, but they didn't overtly intervene. I continued to create the illusion of normalcy while simultaneously plotting the logistics of the next step. At one point, my father suggested that perhaps we should sell the car if we no longer needed it, and my mother agreed, unaware that I had already bought it and was keeping it under control. I saw their habits, their usual conversations, and their attitudes change, how they began to treat the car with caution, which gave me an additional advantage. Every intervention, every hint only strengthened my resolve, and I realized that this stage of preparation would be the most intense and crucial. I developed a plan, considering every possible scenario, thinking through what to do if my parents accidentally observed my actions, how to respond to questions, and how to maintain my distance. The longer I watched, the more I realized that patience was the key, and any sudden move could ruin the entire plan, which was now almost complete. I began to record the days, the times of their visits, their habits, discussed possible reactions with myself, and gradually created a roadmap that would lead to the conclusion of the story with the car. My parents remained in sight, sometimes trying to intervene, sometimes simply observing, and this created a tension that I felt every day. I knew a key moment was approaching, and if everything went according to plan, I would finally be able to close the old story and feel that part of the injustice of my childhood had been righted. A few days after I had finally prepared the car, my parents arrived unannounced. I tried to act calm, as if nothing unusual was happening. My mother immediately approached the car, examined it, and said she had long wanted to check that everything was all right. My father stood nearby, silent, but I could see his gaze was sharp and wary. I pretended to simply check the brakes and oil, and told them about routine maintenance, paperwork, and insurance. They listened, but I could tell something was bothering them. My mother asked why I was so interested in this particular car. I said it was simply a practical decision. It was old, but it worked, and it was convenient for me to have. My father asked several times why I hadn't bought another car, to which I replied that this one was the right price and condition. My mother paused and said she remembered how they once sold Max, and that it must be hard for me to remember my childhood, and that maybe I was trying to compensate for something through the car. I felt the tension and froze, realizing she had almost guessed. I said that for me, a car is just transportation, and that the past has no bearing on the present. My father suddenly suggested that maybe I was just getting revenge on them, and that led to silence. My mother looked at me intently, then looked away and went into the kitchen. I stayed with my father near the car, and he said he wanted to make sure everything was okay, and that I wasn't going to do anything strange with it. I replied calmly that I'd checked everything and that I had no intention of damaging it. They were silent for a while, looking at the car, and I saw the tension gradually ease, but my suspicions remained. After their visit, I realized that any drastic action was impossible while they were around. I had to wait until they left and proceed cautiously. I began carefully planning the times and conditions under which the car would be available only to me, so that no one could interfere. Over the following days, my mother continued to hint at its value, talking about insurance and inspections, and my father occasionally asked questions about its condition. I responded calmly, feigning ordinary interest, and gradually they began to accept that the car was under my control. But deep down I knew their eyes were still watching me, that they suspected something more, and this heightened the tension. Every time I went out to the car, I thought back to my childhood, the loss of Max, and the days when my parents seemed like the only people I could rely on. Now everything was different, and I felt like I was on the verge of implementing my plan, but the moment had not yet arrived. Confronting them had revealed that they knew more than they let on, and that any mistakes could ruin all the preparation. I began to record the days and times of their visits, their habits, their questions, and this helped me formulate a strategy for how to proceed. I knew the emotional tension was only growing, and that drastic measures would soon be necessary, but for now I needed to remain calm and observe. Inside, I felt a mixture of anger, resentment, and a determination to bring this old story to an end, but outwardly I pretended to be casually interested in the car, as if it meant nothing to me. A few days later they came into the garage again. My mother said it was nice that I was taking care of the car, and that she was glad I cared about keeping things tidy. My father looked at me and said it was time to decide what to do with the car if it was no longer needed. I felt the moment approaching, but I knew I had to act methodically. I continued to watch, plan, and wait until they were completely out of sight so that my next step would be safe and final. During this period, I thought again about Max, my childhood feelings, and all the years when the loss of the puppy lingered in my heart, and I realized that I could now close this old gestalt. I planned everything precisely, how to move the car, where to send it, and how to remain calm and discreet. My parents stayed close, sometimes trying to intervene, sometimes simply observing, and it felt like the tension was reaching its breaking point, and the moment of decision was getting closer. I knew I'd have to act soon, and now I was ready, having planned every step in advance to bring closure to the car, and at the same time, to heal an old emotional wound from my childhood. That day, my parents arrived unannounced as I was getting ready to move the car. I noticed them as soon as I pulled up and realized I couldn't proceed as I'd planned. My mother approached first and asked why I needed the old car, why I was so focused on it. I pretended I was simply checking the mechanics, wondering about the brakes and oil, and that I wasn't planning anything out of the ordinary. My father, standing nearby, asked if I was planning anything drastic with the car, since it held a certain value for them and was tied to their memories. I hesitated, gathering my thoughts, and said that the car was just transportation for me, and that I didn't want to inconvenience anyone. My mother paused, looked at me carefully, and said she saw my intense interest in it and that it reminded her of old grievances, like when they sold Max. I felt it was nearly impossible to hide my motives, so I decided to speak carefully but frankly. I explained that the past didn't matter, that I was simply closing the door on myself so as not to be offended by their decisions anymore. My father frowned and said we needed to discuss this before taking any action. I knew the moment was near and said the car needed to be removed, that I could handle it myself and didn't need their help. My mother tried to object, considering it too drastic, but I confidently repeated that I was taking responsibility and the decision had already been made. They stood by the car for a while, watching closely, assessing my intentions. I could see the tension was high, but the resolve within me was stronger. After a while they left and I immediately sprang into action. I prepared the transport, checked the documents, made sure no one could interfere and that the car would be delivered to the recycling center without any problems. I carefully moved it onto the trailer, monitoring every step to ensure no traces were left. As I loaded it, memories of childhood days with Max came to mind, and this feeling motivated me to finish the job once and for all. After the car was securely secured, I headed to the recycling center, completed all the formalities, and made sure the procedure was complete and that the car could no longer return home. At that moment, a strange relief came over me. Years of observation, planning, and caution had yielded the desired result. I knew my parents might suspect something later, but for now they hadn't seen anything and the plan was complete. I returned home and carefully checked the garage and documents, confirming there was no sign of the car being moved. Inside, I felt a mixture of relief, tension, memories of lost Max, and a sense of justice finally being served. I spent the rest of the day watching the garage, making sure the car didn't appear on the street and that no one noticed its disappearance. This was the final step, the conclusion of a long story. My parents temporarily calmed down. My actions had been precise and quiet. I knew I could now control the situation and protect my feelings, even if it required drastic measures. Inside, only memories, lessons, and the feeling that years of planning, observation, and caution had yielded the desired result. The process of moving and disposing of the car took longer than I expected, but every minute was part of the strategy. I checked every document, every step of the procedure, recording every action to ensure no questions arose in the future.
I remembered how my parents handled things as a child, how easily they sold and gave away things that weren't truly theirs, and I compared it to how I was doing everything now. Every move was carefully calculated to bring closure to the car, and at the same time, close an old emotional wound. After completing the procedure, I returned home, locked the garage, checked that there was no trace of the car, no way to find it, and for the first time in a long time, I felt calm. A mixture of relief and inner satisfaction remained inside me, that the long-awaited conclusion had finally arrived. I knew my parents might still speculate, but that didn't matter now. My actions were complete, control was restored, and the feeling of childhood injustice was partially healed. This day marked the final point in the story of the car and what had once happened to Max. I knew that only memories and lessons remained ahead, as well as the feeling that I could now handle my own affairs independently, without having to worry about my parents' past mistakes. Inside, I knew that long years of preparation, observation, and caution had been necessary for this moment of completion to arrive, so that I could now move on, unencumbered by the past. After the car was finally scrapped, the first few days were tense but quiet. I watched my parents' reactions, trying to discern if they'd notice anything missing. My mother called a few days later and asked where the car was, reminding me she was planning to take it to a mechanic. I calmly replied that I'd decided to sell it through someone I knew to avoid spending extra money on maintenance. She paused, asked again several times, but there was no longer any wariness in her voice. My father hinted several times that the old car could be kept for memories, but each time I insisted that practicality and convenience were more important to me. I sensed they were trying to understand the situation, testing my words, but they couldn't find any direct violations. With each passing day, I watched their conversations gradually change. The car was now rarely mentioned, their questions focused on other matters, and this gave me the feeling that the tension was gradually easing. I continued to act calmly, demonstrating that the car was just an ordinary object for me, not one that evoked strong emotions. Sometimes they tried to hint that I was being overly passionate about the topic, but I repeated that for me it was just a thing, that the past shouldn't influence the present. Gradually, my parents got used to the car's absence, stopped asking questions, and talked about it as if it had been sold or disposed of through a third party. I watched their reactions and realized that my plan had been accomplished and that they had accepted the situation. A mixture of relief and tension remained within me. I had achieved my goal, but I realized that the past and childhood grievances still lingered in my memory. The past could no longer influence my decisions, and this gave me a sense of control. I began to use the free space left by the car for my own affairs, and this became a symbolic ending to the story. Sometimes I thought back to my childhood, recalling Max, the days when he was nearby, and I realized that these memories remained with me, but now without the feeling of injustice or loss of control. My parents began to behave more naturally, no longer scrutinizing my actions, and talk of the car disappeared from their conversations. I understood that even if they suspected what had happened, it didn't matter. The story was closed and my control was restored. With each passing day, the sense of closure grew stronger. I occasionally checked the garage, the paperwork, and the house to make sure there was no sign of the car being moved, and this gave me inner peace. At times, thoughts would creep in that I could have acted differently, that revenge wouldn't fully resolve all emotional issues, but I knew I'd taken a step that allowed me to close an old wound and restore a sense of justice. My mother occasionally hinted at the past, talking about the puppy, about the days when everything seemed simpler, but now the conversations were calm, without accusations. My father also began to react less to old stories, discussing more mundane matters. I realized that distance and caution allowed me to conclude the story without open conflict, and my parents' calm attitude indicated their acceptance of the situation. Sometimes I thought back to moments from my childhood, to the loss of Max, to the days when my parents seemed like people I could rely on, and I realized that control over my life was now in my hands. I began planning new projects, new purchases, and new endeavors that had previously seemed impossible due to my parents' influence and past experiences. The car no longer symbolized loss or injustice. It became a symbol of a completed story and personal control. I continued to live my life, but now with the confidence that I could make independent decisions, protect my feelings, and resolve old stories in my own way. My parents gradually accepted my independent behavior without interfering in details, and this gave me a feeling that balance had been restored in the relationship. I realized that long years of observation, planning, and caution had not been in vain. The past no longer defined my life, and my actions with the car became a symbol of the ability to close old stories, maintain control, and move on. The memory of Max and childhood grievances remained within me, but there was no longer a sense of injustice, anxiety, or resentment toward my parents. I realized that the story was over, that relations with my parents were now normalized, and that any future conflicts would be resolved differently, without the interference of old grievances. This period marked a significant milestone in my growth, my recognition of my own strength and my ability to act decisively and methodically. I was no longer a child dependent on the decisions of others. I was an adult, capable of completing my own stories and controlling the consequences. Within, I felt a sense of confidence, calm, and closure, allowing me to look calmly at the past, my parents, and my life. The car was gone, my parents accepted it, and I had closed a long history of childhood injustice, regaining control and inner peace. This final stage allowed me to understand that sometimes seemingly radical actions are necessary to restore balance, protect my feelings, and resolve old emotional narratives. All that remained was memory, experience, and the understanding that I could now act decisively and deliberately, protecting my boundaries and managing my life.